You think you know what Romans thought about sex. You've seen the movies, you've heard the jokes. You have a vague sense of ancient Rome as a place of wild parties, loose morals, and anything goes excess. Togas and orgies and emperors behaving badly. Here's the truth. That picture is almost completely wrong. Roman sexuality was not permissive, in the way modern people assume. It was governed by a rigid, precise, and deeply hierarchical set of rules. Rules that had almost nothing to do with gender and everything to do with power, status, and social position. Understanding those rules changes everything about how you see Rome, and some of what you're about to hear will make ancient Roman society feel simultaneously very alien and uncomfortably familiar. Let's start with the single most important concept in Roman sexual culture, the one that, once you understand it, makes everything else make sense. The Romans did not organize sexuality around the gender of the people involved. Read that again, because it's the key to everything. In the modern world, we tend to think about sexual identity in terms of who someone is attracted to, men, women, or both. That framework simply did not exist in Rome. A Roman looking at our categories would have found them baffling. What Romans cared about, obsessively, institutionally, legally, was something different entirely. They cared about whether you were active or passive, whether you were the one doing or the one being done to. The Latin terms were penetrator and penetrated, and between those two roles, there was an enormous social gulf. The active role was associated with power, masculinity, and social dominance. It was considered appropriate, even expected, for a Roman man of status. The passive role was associated with submission, inferiority, and low social standing. It was considered deeply shameful for any free Roman man to occupy it, regardless of the gender of his partner. This means that a Roman man having sex with another man was not automatically scandalous, provided he was in the active role and provided his partner was of appropriate social status. What was scandalous, what was genuinely shocking to Roman sensibility, was a free Roman man of status taking the passive role, with anyone. The scandal wasn't the same-sex element, the scandal was the submission. Now let's talk about who is considered an acceptable partner, and who absolutely was not. Roman society was stratified in ways that mapped directly onto sexual availability. At the top, free Roman citizens. These were protected. A free Roman man or woman of citizen status was, in theory, sexually off-limits, protected by law from being used as a sexual object by others. The legal concept here was stuprum, a term that meant illicit sexual contact with a person whose status made them off-limits. Committing stuprum against a free Roman citizen was a serious offense. Below citizens, free persons, foreigners, and various categories of lower status free people. The rules here were more complicated and more flexible. At the bottom, legally and socially, slaves. Slaves had no sexual autonomy whatsoever under Roman law. They were property. Their bodies were available to their owners as a matter of course, with no legal protection and no concept of consent as we would understand it. This is one of the darkest aspects of Roman sexuality, and it's important not to sanitize it. The entire system rested on a foundation of people who had no choice. Also considered sexually available, though in a more regulated way, were prostitutes, entertainers, actors, and gladiators. These were people whose professions had stripped them of the social respectability that protected ordinary citizens. They existed in a category Romans called infames, the disreputable, and the normal rules of sexual protection did not fully apply to them. So the Roman sexual system wasn't permissive in a general sense. It was permissive for men of status toward people of lower status, and it was rigidly restrictive in the opposite direction. Power always flowed downward. Let's talk about women. The Roman concept of female sexuality was organized around a single word, pudicitia. Pudicitia meant sexual chastity, modesty, and virtue. It was considered the foundational quality of a respectable Roman woman, the thing that made her a proper wife, a proper mother, a proper Roman. A woman who possessed pudicitia was untouchable in the most literal sense. She could not be approached sexually by anyone other than her husband without it constituting a serious offense against her, her husband, and her family. The performance of pudicitia was public and visible. Respectable Roman women wore specific clothing, the stola, a long draped garment that signaled their status and their sexual unavailability. In public, they were accompanied. They moved through the city in ways that communicated their respectability. Women who fell outside this category, prostitutes, actresses, women convicted of adultery, lost the protection of pudicitia. They became legally and socially available in ways that respectable women were not, and the law treated them differently as a result. Augustus, the first emperor, was so obsessed with the regulation of female sexuality that he passed a series of laws, the Lex Julia, that made adultery a criminal offense for the first time in Roman history. Before Augustus, adultery had been a private family matter handled within the household. Augustus made it a public crime, punishable by exile and confiscation of property. He had personal reasons for this. His own daughter Julia was exiled under these laws, after a series of very public affairs. The emperor who preached traditional Roman morality watched his own family fail to live up to it, a tension that Roman writers noted with varying degrees of sympathy and schadenfreude. Now let's go to Pompeii, because Pompeii is where the abstract becomes concrete. The city was buried by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD and preserved in extraordinary detail, including details that embarrassed later excavators considerably. The city's brothels, lupanaria, from lupa, she-wolf, Roman slang for prostitute, have been excavated and studied in detail. The most famous, on the Via dell'Abbondanza, had small stone rooms, each with a raised stone bed, and above each doorway a painted panel depicting a sexual act. These were, essentially, menus, visual advertisements for what was available inside. The prices were scratched into the walls alongside the services. Graffiti elsewhere in the city records the names and prices of individual prostitutes. It is some of the most direct evidence we have of how commercial sex actually functioned in the Roman world. But Pompeii also shows something else. Erotic imagery was not confined to brothels. It appeared on oil lamps, on household objects, on the walls of private homes, on the entrance to bakeries and shops. The phallus, in Roman culture, was not primarily a sexual symbol. It was an apotropaic symbol, a charm against evil and bad luck. Stone phalluses were carved into streets and buildings as protective talismans. The erotic and the sacred were not separated in the way modern Western culture separates them. This is one of the most genuinely alien aspects of Roman culture, and one of the most commonly misunderstood. When modern visitors see a phallus carved into a Roman street, they assume it marked a route to a brothel. Often it didn't. It was just there, for luck. Let's talk about the poets, because no account of Roman sexuality is complete without them, and they are frankly remarkable. Catullus, writing in the late Republic, produced some of the most intense love poetry in any language. His poems to a woman he calls Lesbia, almost certainly the aristocratic Clodia Metelli, swing between passionate devotion and bitter rage. He uses language that is sometimes explicit, sometimes heartbreakingly tender, sometimes both in the same poem. One of his most famous lines, "Odi et amo, I hate and I love," captures something about Roman erotic feeling that feels startlingly modern. The ambivalence, the obsession, the inability to let go. Ovid went further. His Ars Amatoria, the art of love, was a practical guide to seduction, written in elegant verse, addressed to Roman men and women with equal cynicism and humor. It treated love as a game, seduction as a skill that could be learned and practiced, and romantic relationships as territory to be navigated strategically. Augustus exiled him for it. The official reason given was the poem's immorality, its frank discussion of adultery and seduction at a time when Augustus was trying to legislate traditional family values into existence. Ovid spent the rest of his life on the Black Sea, writing bitter poems about his exile, never allowed to return to Rome. The man who wrote the most sophisticated guide to love in Latin died alone on the edge of the empire. There is something almost Roman in that ending. Here's what makes Roman sexuality genuinely difficult to write about, and genuinely important to understand. The system was not just different from ours. It was structured in ways that produced enormous suffering for enormous numbers of people. Slaves had no protection. Women's sexuality was controlled and policed in ways that served male interests, not their own. People in the infames category, prostitutes, performers, gladiators, were stripped of legal personhood in ways that made exploitation routine. The freedoms that existed in Roman sexual culture were, almost entirely, the freedoms of men with power over people without it. And yet, and this is the complexity, Roman culture also produced Catullus writing about a woman who had broken his heart as if she were his equal. It produced Ovid addressing female readers as intelligent adults capable of strategic thought. It produced legal concepts that, however imperfectly enforced, recognized that certain people deserved protection from sexual coercion. The contradictions are real. The suffering was real. The moments of something that looks at a distance like genuine feeling between people. Those were real too. Roman sexuality was not a paradise of liberation. It was a hierarchy, enforced by law and custom and violence, that benefited the powerful at the expense of the powerless. Sound familiar? The Romans were not us. Their categories were not our categories. Their assumptions were not our assumptions. But the human experiences underneath those categories, desire, obsession, jealousy, tenderness, shame, the hunger for connection, those don't change. Catullus felt them. The woman whose name was scratched into the wall of a Pompeian brothel felt them, in whatever form her circumstances allowed. 2,000 years ago, in a city that no longer exists, in a world organized by rules we would find unrecognizable. And somehow, reading the poems, looking at the walls, holding the objects they left behind, it doesn't feel as far away as it should. If this gave you a new way of seeing Rome, leave a comment. Tell me what surprised you most. The next video is right there. See you there.